Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. This is the Wilkerson Report, and now joining us is Larry Wilkerson. Larry is the former Chief of Staff for U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, currently an adjunct professor of government at the College of William and Mary, and a regular contributor to the Real News Network. Thanks for joining us again, Larry.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
So, the Trump administration is reason for great concern on a lot of counts, whether it's the potential attack or aggression against Iran, whether it's who knows what in Syria, repression of political rights in the United States, targeting of Hispanics, Latinos. I mean, all of these things are potentially horrendous, but perhaps the most threatening is virtually an existential threat is the attitude towards climate change and climate change denial, and the idea that any attempt, even though it was pretty modest to begin with, by the United States to deal and live up to the Paris Accords, and really it was necessary to go further. 7 of the leading climate scientists prior to the Trump victory said that by 2050, we would already reach 2 degrees of warming from pre-industrial rates, which is a rather critical threshold. What's your take on where this, first of all, this White House is on the issue of climate change, and where the Republican Party is? Because so far, certainly all I've heard from almost all the Republican Party is more climate denial.
I think we're making some progress in that regard, Paul. I think the president's having signed the National Security Memorandum connecting national security with climate change was a major move forward, as was Paris. I agree with you that we are playing with a loaded deck here because these temperatures that have been set and so forth, even if we were to meet them, might not be sufficient in the long run. But I think we're making progress. We're going to make more progress at Marrakesh, I think. The Paris Accord has come into being a lot faster than people thought, so Marrakesh was really going to be a rush.
But if the Paris Accord itself was, certainly not sufficient, this number I said about 2% by 2050 was a
lot more.
If all governments
that pledged than what we had in the past, though. Copenhagen was a joke. Paris was at least a step forward.
No, I agree. I'm not saying it was nothing, but I'm saying the report by these scientists led by Robert Watson, the former chair of the IPCC, was that if all the governments that pledged in Paris lived up to all the pledges, we're still hitting 2% by 2050, like 34 years from now.
2 degrees.
And now, how does one see 2 degrees? I'm sorry, yeah. How does one see? Certainly, that's not happening now with the Trump victory. But you've been on the Hill talking to some Republicans and others about climate change. What are you hearing?
I'm hearing that the Republican Party has some people. I'm knowing that the Republican Party has some people in it who are seized of this issue, particularly on the national security front. Understand that it has ramifications like, for example, the largest shipyards on the East Coast, the ones that host Ford-class aircraft carriers and so forth, are going underwater. They understand that in the recent North Carolina flooding, there were U.S. Army units who couldn't deploy, who couldn't move because the roads were flooded. They understand that Langley Air Force Base couldn't take off its fighter aircraft for periods of time when its runways were underwater. So these national security ramifications of climate change, particularly sea rise, are putting these people in the know, if you will, about what climate change portends from a national security point of view. And from that point of view, I think we've been able to make some progress in changing some minds about what's happening. What we have not been successful in with all of them so far is to convince them that humans are actually, by their actions, CO2 emissions and so forth, contributing to this change, and therefore we have an ability to mitigate as well as to just adapt to what's happening naturally. But that's coming, and I'm somewhat optimistic about the fact that I've been across the country and seen what we're doing in the States, regardless of Washington, regardless of what Trump might say or what Pence might say, or James Inhofe from Oklahoma, who's a Luddite on this issue because he gets money from ExxonMobil. We're not really caring out there in the hinterland what Washington says or does. They're actually doing it. Iowa is so full of wind power and solar power right now that in another few years they'll be completely off the grid. Other states are doing other things, particularly coastal states where a majority of the population is, by the way. and where a lot of military installations are. New Orleans, take New Orleans. New Orleans should have moved. It should have picked up and moved after Katrina. If we have another Category 4 or, God forbid, a 5, New Orleans will have to move. These sorts of things are going to be profound, and they're going to take the James Inhofes of the world and rub their face in climate change. So I'm not saying we're going to do it fast enough, but I am saying that we've got some momentum going now, and I do hope that that momentum continues. I don't see Donald Trump being stupid enough to ignore this completely. Not when Royal Dutch Shell, for example, has made billion-dollar decisions based on its understandings of where we're going with climate change and other private concerns like Shell. So I know there's a lot of opposition. I know the Mercers and the Koch brothers and others are funding that opposition. But I think the scientists and the facts are winning ultimately. I just hope it's in time.
Yeah, I mean, Robert Mercer, whose daughter Rebecca is on the Trump transition team and was the guy who installed Bannon and Kellyanne Conway in the Trump campaign that essentially saved the campaign and made Trump president. Mercer's a major funder of climate denial institutes. As far as I know, he's about second to the Koch brothers in terms of the amount of money spent on climate denial. And they've had some effect. In a recent Yale study, when people were asked, do they think there's global warming, 70% said yeah, but only 53% of those thought it was caused by humans. And when asked how urgent it was, only 16% thought it was urgent and would affect them and their family directly. I think this also explains why this wasn't so much of a priority for the Obama administration, even though they did something. It was far from what the scientists said needed to be done. And they just didn't think it was politically expedient to make such an issue out of climate change. And then Hillary Clinton, mentioned it, but that was all it ever was a mere mention, never with any seriousness. It seems to me if there's some forces out there that are getting it, they better speak up. There's not a lot of time left here.
Well, I think there's quite a bit of time left, and I'm not as pessimistic as you are. I was until I saw what was going on all across the country and what we're doing already, and I understand what other countries are doing in that regard too. I'm not as cynical or pessimistic as I was. We do have time, and we have time to do this in a better way right now. In another 10 or 15 years, we'll probably be up against the gun. And what does that mean? It means, in essence, that the anecdote I'll describe to you that happened over in Norfolk recently is going to be the profound waker-upper. It's the woman who, when I was talking about this, rose in the back of the theater in Norfolk and said, "Tell me about it. I know about it. The water's in my backyard." Well, when the water's in everybody's backyard, as it was in Cedar Rapids recently, as it was in North Carolina recently, then we'll be seized of the issue. The question is, will it be too late?
Well, why are you saying we've got a lot of time when scientists are saying prior to the Trump administration, the models they were getting, and this is 2 different scientific institutes, not just this one of the 7 leading scientists I'm talking about. There's another climate science institute in North Carolina. These first group came up with 2050. The other one came up with 2051, hitting 2 degrees. And the 2-degree threshold is very critical because it's not just the effects of how serious climate change affects droughts and flooding and severe weather and such. Crossing the 2-degree threshold means it's very much more difficult not to get to the 3 and 4-degree threshold. The warmer it gets, the more difficult it is to pull back. And now there's predictions of 4 to 6 degrees by the end of the century, and some even higher than that. And those are catastrophic if the scientific predictions of what happens there. The recent report that I'm citing here, which is called The Truth About Climate Change, if people want to look it up and look up Robert Watson is connected with it. They're saying there's no time, and this was prior, as I say, prior to Trump. They're already talking about the need to have a serious look at geoengineering, which they themselves acknowledge is very untested and untried, but still the situation's so dire, so grave, so threatening. They're saying we're going to have a very serious look at geoengineering. Plus, they're saying if we want to stop getting to 4 and 6 degrees by the end of the century, by 2065 have to be 0 fossil fuel. And we're nowhere near on that route. And with this administration, we're going backwards, not forwards.
Yeah, geoengineering in the simulations that we've run proves rather catastrophic. Whether you're doing the aerosols in the atmosphere or you're doing the giant mirrors or whatever, we don't want to get to the point where we are so desperate, as we did in one simulation that the Center for Naval Analyses ran, where we're 2050, 2060, and we're actually so desperate that we're doing these things that rebound on themselves and actually create more problems than we're solving. So geoengineering, I don't think, at least not right now, the technology I've seen, is the answer. But again, I don't buy the 2 degrees, 4 degrees, and so forth as being inevitable if we begin to work, and we begin to work at least somewhat in accord with what was decided in Paris, and I assume will be furthered in Marrakesh. We do have a chance. This science is not perfect. The models are not perfect. The scary thing about the models is that when they show their imperfections, they generally show them in a negative way, not a positive way. That is to say, the ice melt or the sea rise is faster, not slower than the model predicted, which is somewhat frightening. But basically, I think we still have an opportunity to do something about what's happening to us. We're going to have a period here, Paul, where North America is in fine shape. We're going to have longer growing periods. We're going to have higher yields. We're going to have more food, more profit. We're also going to have a lot more water, and the flooding is going to be difficult to deal with, challenging. But we're going to be raising crops year-round in the southern parts of the provinces of Canada, and crops year-round, probably even as far as midway in places like Saskatchewan and British Columbia and Manitoba and so forth. What's going to be the problem there, our models tell us, is that in the South, particularly in Western Asia, where you're seeing problems right now with the 200,000 Syrian farmers who had no water for 2 years in a row and contributed to this conflict that's so bloody in Syria today, what you're going to see there is these massive migrations. So what we see in our models is that the peer powers along the Northern Hemisphere, the United States being prominent amongst them, we're manning our borders with machine guns and walls, Donald Trump come true, because these millions of people who have no food or water are on the move, looking for food and water, and we got it. So there are plenty of dire scenarios in this, and they began, as you said, to take shape around mid-century. That's in my grandchildren's lifetime, so it's not like it's out there where I don't have to worry about it. Everybody has to worry about it. But I come back to my original point. When the water's up to your knees, everybody will be seized to the issue. I just hope that's not too late.
All right, thanks for joining us, Larry.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.